name is Danny Jones. I'm a children and young persons counsellor, and I work for a school-based counselling service in North Wales. Now, I must admit I was a little bit apprehensive when Susie reached out to me today, as when I finished postgrad, I made it very clear to my friends and family that if you ever see me in university again, I've been kidnapped and I'm potentially under duress. But despite that, just to reassure you all, I am here of my own free will today. So, tell you a little bit about my journey, which started way back when in 2011. I think there's probably some informal things that brought me to actually being on my first course at Glyndŵr University. I started off with a diploma there. Prior to that, I did have to do an access course to prove that at the mature age of 27, I was still capable of learning before the university would let me in. Our course was children and young person focused. There was a few authors that we studied very heavily on that course, kind of like Virginia Axline, John Bowlby, Margot Sutherland, and the works of those people still very much stay with me today. After graduating from Glyndŵr, I went back for more. In 2016, I went and did a postgrad certificate in Focusing Orientated Psychotherapy, which is one of the tribes of the person-centered nation. And I guess what drew me towards that course was that I was always very intrigued by why therapy worked for some people and what didn't. And I think one of the underpinning tenets of Focusing Orientated Psychotherapy was it was about how people spoke during therapy, not so much what they spoke about and how that raw experience is symbolised there. So for me, at that point, I very much sort of began to identify as an integrative therapist. And then if that wasn't enough, I went back and did my MA in 2017 at UEA. At that point, I thought I was done, but then we go on to the middle column here. So as we know, the world began to change very rapidly as we went into COVID. So our schools were locked down at the drop of a hat, and as the chaps were saying earlier, everything just stopped for everyone at that moment. But the challenge we had was, okay, well, how do we continue with our cohort of very vulnerable young people? So obviously we couldn't go into the schools, everyone was locked down there, so we did some walk and talk ecotherapy training, so how we connect with the outdoors and everything around utilising the spaces that we have there. So we were able to connect with our clients in that way. I did a certificate in online counselling through ACTO, so don't hate me guys. And in 2020, 2021, what we began to notice as a school-based service was that where we sit in terms of the tier of help, if you like, tier 2, we kind of deal with anything that's maybe deemed a bit above school wellbeing services, but slightly below specialist CAMS. We'd find there was a group of what we call tier 2.5, so they're potentially above our threshold, but slightly below CAMS. So they fall between the cracks a little bit. And what we kind of went away and did some training and research on was DBT, dialectical behavioural therapy, and we now run that in groups in school. And after a successful pilot about 4 years ago now, it's still running to this day. Again, what we've noticed over the years, and what I've certainly noticed, is that the level of distress amongst young people is just going up and up and up each year, especially since COVID. The kind of year group that COVID hit at the time, you can almost follow those students like a thread all the way from year 7 to sort of year 11 where they are now. So I went away and trained in EMDR, which again is another aspect that I've integrated into my practice there. In terms of my employment journey, Received College, that was where I actually started my clinical training placement there, so I pestered those guys. And then all the way down to where we are here now with the Denbighshire Independent Young Persons Counselling Service as a young persons counsellor there. And if I move on to the next slide here, what I'd like to talk about is just to give you a real whistle-stop tour of my experience of some of the therapeutic considerations when working with young people here. So I guess for me, I always say to young people, I haven't got any goals as a counsellor as such. There's no right or wrong way to do counselling. The only goal I have, if anything, is to try and understand as best as I can what it's like to be you, what it's like to walk in your shoes. But I won't always get that right, because the only person who knows what it's like to be you is you. You're the only expert on yourself there. So cultivating that therapeutic relationship, offering the core conditions and establishing the psychological contact just by listening to these kids. And I guess tending to these considerations is kind of roughly how I do it if you were to map it out. So Am I offering a relationship that is empowering to the young person? I'm always mindful that there's a power imbalance in schools that exists between, with young people. In school, adults tell young people what to wear, when to speak, what side of the corridor to walk on, when to go to the toilet. And when young people come in to see me, they often call me sir and what have you, and it kind of, to this day, it still cringes me a little bit. So I'm like, I'm Danny, you don't have to call me sir. Whichever teacher may have brought you along, they have to call me sir, but you can call me Danny. And even something as simple as letting the young person choose where they want to sit in the room. You choose the chair, this is your room and what have you. Even things like that can be really, really important. Be mindful of age-appropriate language, awareness of developmental stages and neurodiversity. So I'll always adapt my language depending on who's in front of me. I wouldn't speak to a year 6 the way you would, the same way as a year 13. You never know what kind of young person is going to walk through the door. Sometimes it can be wise beyond the years, and you forget that it's a young person who's there. They could be neurodivergent, so even non-verbal things like eye contact can play a massive difference, and they have to be attuned to the client. And again, pretty self-explanatory things like going at the young person's pace, being non-patronising, not talking down to them, and respecting their problem-solving abilities. Noticing and drawing on their resources that they have, celebrating what does work well for them. Taking the time to understand their world, their perspective, not guessing. This is one of the most critical ones here. And it's a point I always stress to myself. Therapeutic relationships with young people are hard-earned. There's no automatic assurance of trust, and that trust is very tenuous. It takes a long time to earn and seconds to break it. And only when this trust is built are you then allowed, or am I then allowed, into their world. And what I've come to learn is that being my true or authentic self is absolutely key to this. And I do firmly believe that counselling relationships that are kind of fueled by fear have no healing elements to them. And without that kind of basic, fundamental human quality, they are scary and they're ineffective. And what I also have to remember with young people is being mindful of that kind of ecology of their family unit, and their dependence on adults. Young people don't always have the same autonomy as adults to impact or change their circumstances, and recognising how stifling that can be for a young person by staying in their frame of reference. It's really critical in being allowed to enter there and understand their subjective world. Okay, next we'll move on to a little bit of kind of what it's like working in a school environment. So I get to go to all the beauty spots like Real and Prestatyn and all the lovely places like that. So delivering counselling in a school-based setting can be challenging and jarring for the young person. The young person's in the throes of the school day, and often you finish a session, they're going straight back into lessons. So it's quite a rapid shift in environment to get the head back into lessons, and sometimes that can curtail processing. Safeguarding, I could talk about safeguarding all day, but I know I've probably got about 2.5 minutes left, so I'll contain myself here. So safeguarding, child protection, absolutely paramount. It is everybody's business, and clear contracting and understanding around that is absolutely key. And if a disclosure does need to be made, and inevitably with children and young people, you will come across that at some point. I'll always try and do this in collaboration with the young person, again, thinking about that empowerment. And so we can both decide who the best person is to help. You can sit in grey areas. You might often find yourself walking a tightrope between safeguarding and the autonomy, making sure that you're being mindful of that young person's right to be self-governing. And if you're not attentive to the client and that whole disclosure process, they can backtrack, they can withdraw what they've said and what have you. So a very grey area. And as a therapist, I guess the next thing I would want to move on to here, because I have 1 minute left and I'm going to start telling you the abridged version of things. Consent is the one I probably want to move on to here as well. So the young person's perception of counselling, contracting, and how previous experiences can distort that, because often I'm not the only person from a various agency that's in school. So what I've learned about consent over the years has shifted rapidly. So in our service, the young person needs to be GILIT competent if they want to consent to counselling, so they can understand as best as they can what the ramifications are around entering counselling. But for me, and I'll own this when I say this, is that I don't think consent is always binary or static. It can be fluid. So what I mean by this is a young person might agree to consent to counselling during an initial meeting, but I often find myself revisiting this in kind of an organic way as counselling unfolds. You know, for example, you could move into areas that previously weren't known to the client or to yourself, you know, such a trauma, and then you might find yourself working with the EMDR, and that's, at that point, consent needs to be fully written and revisited. Okay, so disempowerment of the young person, I know we've very briefly spoken about that there. So, as I alluded to earlier, you know, young person more often than not are referred to counselling by the wellbeing staff in the school, and whilst they're supposed to gain the consent of the young person, referrals can sometimes be someone else's good idea. So the young person can sometimes feel like, oh, I've been sent here, but during that initial meeting and throughout the counselling relationship, making it abundantly clear that the choice to come to counselling is theirs and theirs alone. And a whistle-stop tour, because I promise you, if you try to look at all these data points, your eyes will very quickly run out of breath. But CORE, or YP-CORE, some of you may have heard of, is what we use in our counselling service. And it's a 10-question questionnaire which measures psychological distress. The blue line is the score that they have. The red line is risk. Anything above 30 usually goes to CAMS there. But the good thing about CORE is, you may have all heard of evidence-based practice. YP-CORE is practice-based evidence. It only outputs whatever measures you put in with your young person there. Again, like any service that is funded, you know, part of our service is funded by Welsh Government. This data does feed back in, but it informs policy and it can inform funding as well. And it is a very useful drill-down tool as well. It's my second to last slide. So it's usually broken down into 4 domains here. So commonly experienced problems or symptoms, how the young person functions in relation to those problems, are they taking any risk of themselves, and how is their well-being. And this does not replace clinical judgment by any sense of the word, but it's a good therapeutic tool in sort of contextually understanding how the young person's experience are affecting them over time, which domains might be shifting between sessions, and where they might be stuck. So, what am I passionate about as a counsellor? I'm really passionate about making therapy more accessible to males. Young males typically make up less than 40% of counselling referrals to school counselling services across North Wales. In our service, last year it was 34%. Yet in recent years, you know, there's been more national attention given to issues relating to male mental health, particularly suicide rates. It is the most common cause of death in young men at 20 to 49. So there's that massive gap between service need and service usage. You know, they don't access help at the same rate at which they're presenting with distress. So I won't get into all the reasons of that why, because that's a whole other topic in itself. So in 2021, our service launched a project called Missing Boys, and this was the brainchild, and it was conceived by my learned colleague Ben in the service, and that aimed to address the gap by offering a more male-friendly approach to therapy. It was a really successful pilot, it was award-winning there, and what we learned during this pilot is that young men don't always want therapy to look like therapy, and a shoulder-to-shoulder rather than a face-to-face approach can be preferred and often perceived as more accessible there. And the people who engage in the project, a lot of them were young males who previously declined counselling because the idea of being in a room with another guy talking about feelings was just terrifying. So my last slide before I have this probably taken off me. These are some of my favourite therapeutic experiential items, if you like. So Connect 4, Jenga. Jenga isn't a particularly relaxing one, but that transfer of anxiety between taking your turn is often very exciting. A wonderful Margot Sutherland with her cards there, helping facilitating young people to talk about emotions. Rory Story Cubes, something everyone goes to. Everyone's story is totally unique and it's a good axle grease there. And then you've got your sensory items like kinetic sand and Play-Doh, and you'll be surprised what age people will go for them, even the sixth formers. Okay guys, that's me. I'm going to make space for somebody else. Thank you.